Today I want to talk about Adam22 and the NoJumper podcast. For those of you that might not know, NoJumper is a hip-hop themed podcast, and there's actually a lot of overlap and confluence with some of the stuff that I talk about on this channel with regards to race. And the tagline of the podcast is the coolest podcast in the world. To me, that's kind of silly. It seems like it's one of the lamest and stupidest podcasts in the world. It's responsible for bringing to fruition some of the worst rap imaginable over the last 10 years. It's also responsible for, more lately, I guess, in the last couple of years, it's become a kind of a more pretentious hip-hop themed version of Jerry Springer. They, for example, bring pimps on. Very sanctimonious pimps, actually. They bring on sanctimonious pimps to argue with sanctimonious prostitutes. They bring on fake pimps to be yelled at by real pimps, that sort of thing. So, it's kind of like the top tier of, I don't know, pop culture schlock. I think sort of like delving into his personality and the way that he's carried himself over the years, and especially the revelations of the last few months or so, it does shed a lot of light on things like segregation, cultural segregation, the way that societies tend to be structured, irrespective of where you might feel you fall on any sort of cultural divide. There is something to the idea, right, of being born into a culture versus adopting it. And there's also something to the idea of being born to a culture versus adopting it versus actually sort of, taking upon the implications of a given culture. Now, Adam22, he's a guy that seems to have no sense of real boundaries whatsoever. He's a white boy that has forgotten the fact that he's a white boy. And although I'm saying that now, I'm actually not even 100% sure whether he's a white boy that forgot the fact that he's a white boy, or he's a white boy that is in fact extremely conscious of the fact that he is white and is perfectly able to use that to his advantage. And for this next part, the only reason I even know about it is because Kwame Brown, who used to be a basketball player, and he recently had a stream where he brought to people's attention this like recent drama in the NoJumper universe where there's been like a kind of mutiny, I guess, of the black employees versus Adam22. And I think, first of all, just dwelling on that for a second is important. Isn't it kind of fascinating that the schlockiest kind of hip-hop, imaginable hip-hop podcast, whatever, happens to be manned by a white man? It is a white man that has set up essentially these fights between pimps and prostitutes. It is a white man that has collected any number of black employees surrounding him. And it's a white man that ultimately profits the most off of this, right? I said earlier, irrespective of what individual choices might be made in these kinds of sagas, it should be kind of telling that just structurally, this is the way that things happen to play out. So in the midst of this mutiny, some details came out that Kwame Brown was analyzing that I think is worth to really sort of elaborate upon. So basically what happened was one of the employees, AD, he was upset that Adam22 was platforming Richard Spencer. Now, I don't really care about this idea of platforming, right? I think you could platform people appropriately. You could have like appropriate pushback and whatnot. So I'm not really against the idea of even an avowed neo-Nazi like Richard Spencer, who claims that he's not a neo-Nazi any longer. But regardless, I wouldn't have an issue with that. But some people do. And this was the source of the argument. And in the midst of this argument, some details came out of all the emotions. At some point, AD says something like, and you know what? I even put my life on the line for you. And Adam22, and this is what Kwame Brown highlighted, he just sort of stops and he says, Yeah, but I don't really know what that has to do with anything. Now, I found that a fascinating exchange because it's pretty clear that of the two of them, they have a pretty kind of different point of view on what it means to, either like cultivate a friendship or what it means to be an employee somewhere. Because there is a pretty big disconnect, isn't there, right? If you think about the fact that here was a guy that was essentially hired, right? I'm sure that he has like, various talents or whatever. But it seems like a big idea in Adam22's head, at least when he went through the hiring process, was I need to get a black guy around me that has some sort of street connections and street credibility. Because if I'm a white man in this kind of world, A, I want the street credibility, and B, since I'm not actually from the street, I might have to find a way to deal, right, in some sort of like, I don't want to call it a protection racket, but he kind of treats it as a protection racket, doesn't he? And I'm going to speak as a white person, speaking also to Adam22 as a white person, right? I don't think he's ever going to watch this video, but if he does, right, one of the interesting parts is I know what he's doing because I've been in somewhat similar circumstances. And if we're just talking one-on-one, there can't be any black men that he surrounds himself with as essentially meat shields. So AD is approaching Adam22 not just as an employee, he's approaching him as someone that is a potential friend. And one of the tokens of friendship that AD might sort of understand growing up, I guess, in his circumstances is if you find a friend, right, somebody that you're willing to risk things with, one of the things that you might want to risk is your own physical safety. One of the interesting aspects to black-white relationships is how there's this kind of very odd mutual affection that develops between the two by virtue of the fact that they come from totally different worlds. So on the one hand, there are white people who grow up, let's say, street adjacent, and they're into, let's say, black culture, right? They're interested in cultivating friendships with people who appreciate the culture that they are into. On the other hand, there's this kind of continued fascination that black Americans have, and it's not always necessarily very healthy. Oftentimes, it's it could be anything from a mix of grudging respect to perhaps an idea that, okay, well, if they're gonna get street credibility from me, maybe I could get some sort of respectability from them, right? It could be like a variation of all that. It doesn't even have to be very conscious, but one thing that I've noticed is that there is very often this mutual affection that develops just based purely on differences, based on, it's kind of like almost like a zoo-like atmosphere where you have two people from essentially different existences that are watching each other, sizing each other up, and approaching one another's relationships through very different assumptions. One thing that I've noticed growing up was how, being also a white kid that was like very into hip hop, very often I would have the same kind of thing where I would develop friendships with people that were non-white, and there was this kind of like, sometimes like maybe it was just them showing off, maybe there was something else involved, but very often it was something like, hey, like, if you have any problems with anybody in the school, like for instance, like I went to a school with a lot of gang members. If you have any problems with anybody in school, just let me know. I'm going to take care of it. And it often left me feeling a little bit strange and uncomfortable because I just sort of knew that on the fundamental level, first of all, I didn't know these people that well to begin with. And second, there's not that many circumstances where I would just like randomly put, my life on the line for the sake of something that I don't understand or for the sake of someone that I don't know. And that's because this is simply, the world that I grow up in. This is just simply how things are done. Now, on some level, Adam22 must understand that this is the dynamic that he's found himself in. He understands the sacrifices that are essentially being made for him. And since he has money and since he has status, he does the white boy thing of, I'm going to pay him off, right? He has a salary, he's putting his life on the line, right? Well, but that's fine, right? I'm paying him for it. This is not a kind of like a loyalty based on friendship. This is a business transaction. And this is perfectly valid in terms of approaching things from a business perspective, but it's not valid if you're aware that the person on the other end of it simply does not view it as a purely business transaction, right? You are now taking that native black conservatism and that native sort of a black loyalty that's kind of commingling in this relationship, and you're essentially exploiting it, because I'm not exactly sure what the details are of him putting his life on the line, but whatever this guy's salary was, so what exactly is like how do you exactly measure something like that, right? I mean, because it's one thing if he was like technically working as a bodyguard or whatever, but essentially he's like a producer or something and a co-host. If you look at the kinds of things that Adam was involved in as a youth, his father went to prison for something fraud related. I forget exactly what the details were, but he was highly connected, it seems, both in terms of politics and in other ways. So Adam definitely comes from a privileged background. And as is the case with many privileged kids, when it finally comes time to, I guess, like establish his own identity, he ends up seeking out altercations and relationships that are somehow street adjacent, right? He becomes, like, he gets involved in like credit card forgery or something like that, credit card fraud. I forget what the details of that were, but right, it's crimes that are, it's white boy shit, right? That's the thing. That's the other funny part of all this, right? To the extent that he was involved in this kind of street stuff, it's all material that never really rises to high violence, right? And eventually he gets to the point where he now needs to collect black tokens. He needs to collect those that will make him feel kind of even perhaps more native to the culture that he's adopting. At the same time, only one of these groups is either willing or is forced to make these like very lopsided sacrifices, right? From Adam's perspective, his sacrifice is potentially losing some money. From the perspective of the black tokens that he is collecting and the goons and the grunts that he is collecting, and not to say that they are in fact goons and grunts, but that is the way that he is essentially treating them. So from their perspective, they are putting their lives on the line. And you see this play out also in interesting ways, that kind of like in other parts of his life. Like, he did eventually get married, and he is married to a white woman. Now, this is not to say that Adam should not be, marrying a white woman. Obviously, anybody should marry anybody that they feel like. Good relationships are hard to come by. If you find something that works, by all means, go for it. The only reason I bring this up is to simply make the point that structurally, the way that things happen to be set up is you will tend to congregate towards people that look like you. It doesn't matter what culture you adopt. It doesn't matter if in 95% of your interactions you're surrounded by black men, black women. You will still tend to, not always, but there's a kind of central tendency here. You might find yourself, right, getting in a deeper and deeper entanglement with those that are white. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the partners and others that are involved in NoJumper that are not actually like public faces on the show, it wouldn't surprise me if some of these like investment buddies or whatever are also white. At the same time, right, it would also explain why we have like so many resentments between black and white people over things like, I don't know, like patterns of marriage, relationships, that kind of thing. And all kinds of unhealthy pathologies and resentments will come out as a result of this. I mean, I'm doing this video soon of this like long form critique of White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And although I have lots of issues with that book, and overwhelmingly it's a bad book, right? Let's not sugarcoat that part of it. But there is something to the core concept of both white fragility as well as this idea that we are kind of like perpetually segregated. And this is going to create wildly different sets of assumptions. My friend Keith Jackowicz, who appears on this channel, has recently brought up this concept of Afropessimism, this idea that based on just the kind of like categories and modes of being that are forced upon black people, white people, the segregation might be just like too strict, right? Too hard to get over in any kind of substantive way, right? There's this idea that to what extent can there be true integration in the way that we want it? So I'm not exactly sure if I buy the Afro pessimist argument, but at the same time, there is something to the idea that nothing at all is being done about like actual genuine segregation. People are scared to be in each other's neighborhoods, sometimes for good reason, sometimes for bad reason. We have all kinds of lopsided relationships that are quietly exploitative, as well as just like ending up with all kinds of like misapprehensions as far as like where we are. But again, I do think it's fascinating that in the center of all this drama, this kind of like a vortex, there is a white man who is essentially pulling the strings. There is a white man who is calling himself the kind of a taste setter, right? He wants to view himself as somebody that pushes the culture forward by pushing his own personal preferences, which has its own dangers if they are truly just personal preferences and not something that objectively is meritorious. It's these kinds of power structures that can't really be avoided that easily, right? You can't, to go back to the Afro-pessimist aspects of all this, this is not something that you could just easily do away with. Another thing that I would ask, which is something for Adam22 to answer for himself, is, to what extent is he just slumming it? I remember when I was reading Dan Schneider's book, Show and Tell, he makes the point that I think is very valid, which is there's certainly a contingent of white people out there that start to take black culture upon themselves, and they adopt it merely because they feel fearful that they would fail out of any other culture. And in combination with Adam's personal history with things like credit card fraud, maybe he needed to, as he was like seeking out, I guess, this identity, one didn't work, maybe this other one would work. And this obviously just doesn't apply only to him. I remember recently reading this article about DJ Vlad, who was, he's another white man in hip hop culture. One of the people that also, like Adam, fascinatingly enough, they often ask questions that could very well get the people answering them into trouble. Sometimes it's about open cases, right? Criminal cases, that sort of thing. Sometimes it's about something else altogether. There's often this kind of feeling like, these guys are probing for answers about things as if they're like, in the street doing street shit with these people, right? And not just essentially spectators in this like wider zoo that they're kind of constructing for themselves and for others. They know the audience is, right? They know what people are interested in. And DJ Vlad, I alluded to, he's not too different in that regard. I remember reading an article where he was making the claim that, as he was asked about like a local rapper that was in his office, he was asked something like, "Oh, is this your security?" He said something like, "No, he's not my security. He's a guy that I'm trying to turn into like a fixture on this channel. But if there's like a street problem, he's gonna take care of it." Again, right? It's this idea of loyalty, this like sort of like inborn, sorry, not inborn, this sort of like native, almost inborn, right? Practically might as well be inborn, right? So not really much else to say. If you're a patron, thank you for being a patron. If you're a subscriber, thanks for being a subscriber. And if not, well, you could sort of change that right now. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you soon.